All right, good morning, everyone. Since I heard a pin drop, I assume you're all ready to get started. Everyone settled in nicely. All right, so welcome to day 2 of the June Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council meeting. I know you say June already, and I say yes. That's how 50 years go by. All right, so let's see. Our first agenda item today is Unmanaged Commercial Landings Report. So we have Julia and Tori from staff, and they'll get us started whenever you two are ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. So we'll jump right into it because we have a lot of information to cover with this report this year. So hopefully you're all caffeinated and awake and ready to see lots of numbers. So first I wanted to acknowledge that there was a team of people who worked on the report this year, including myself. Tori helped out on the report with a lot of really cool data visualizations and analysis, and she'll present those slides. Chris Winiarski at the GARFO Analysis and Program Support Division helped us with the data, and we very much appreciate that, making sure we have all our data right. And Paul Rago worked under contract to the council to help with some new statistical analyses this year. Paul is online, so is Chris, and they can help answer questions. I'm going to summarize Paul's work briefly, but he'll be available to provide more information and answer questions as needed. So the objectives of this discussion are to basically just review this year's report and provide any feedback you might have. So feedback could be things like questions, anything that you would like to see further evaluated, anything that's potentially of concern, and anything that you think could be an improvement for future reports. But first, I'll provide some background on why the council get these reports every year. So this is a follow-on from the Unmanaged Forage Omnibus Amendment, which the council took final action on in 2016 and was implemented in 2017. So the goal of the Forage Amendment was to prohibit the development of new and expansion of existing directed commercial fisheries on unmanaged forage species in mid-Atlantic federal waters, and not to prohibit them indefinitely, but only until the council has had an adequate opportunity to both assess the scientific information relating to any new or expanded directed fisheries and consider potential impacts to existing fisheries, fishing communities, and the marine ecosystem. So through this amendment, the council sought to protect the structure and function of marine ecosystems from the potential threat of unregulated, unsustainable levels of commercial harvest of forage species and to advance an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. And that's all language that I just pulled from the amendment. So the way that the council went about in a concrete way trying to achieve those lofty goals was to establish a commercial possession limit for over 50 previously unmanaged forage species in mid-Atlantic federal waters. And the species are listed on the screen here. So the possession limit is 1,700 pounds of combined weight of all of those species together. You can see that obviously the forage amendment doesn't cover every single unmanaged species, and commercial harvest can still increase even under the new possession limit. Therefore, the council has asked for these annual updates on unmanaged commercial landings, which we've been getting since 2018. And these reports are intended to cover all unmanaged commercial landings, not just the forage amendment species. The goal is to monitor for signs of developing unmanaged commercial fisheries in the Mid-Atlantic region. It's important to note that new or growing fisheries could develop for a variety of reasons. There could be changing species distributions, changing markets, changes in other fisheries, or other reasons. And increasing landings do not necessarily indicate an ecological issue or a need for management. And the information in these reports is intended to be a high-level summary to help determine if further evaluation is needed and if consideration of a potential management response may be warranted. So this is just intended to be a first look at things. So what does it mean to be unmanaged? Well, for the purposes of this report, we came up with the definition on the screen. So a species is unmanaged only in locations where there's no possession limit, size limit, seasonal closure, or limited access in the commercial fishery. So we know that some states have an open access general commercial landings permit that might have reporting requirements associated with it. So if there's something like that, but not one of the measures on the screen, that does not count as managed for the purposes of this report, because we wanted to focus on the types of management measures that would limit what people can actually harvest. And each year we reach out to the states to ask for updates on what species are managed in their states to be sure that we're capturing only landings in places where each species is not managed. So I just want to say that we really appreciate the states responding to my emails every single year, asking if anything changed, just so we can make sure that these reports are accurately capturing what is managed where. So just to provide an example of how this works, you'll see white perch landings in the report, and white perch are managed in some states, but not all states. And so in the report, we're only showing landings in states where there's none of these management measures based on input that we get from the states each year. And Appendix A lists for everything shown in the report, the states where we're counting it as managed. The data in the reports are coming from the Catch Accounting and Monitoring System, or CAMS. This is mostly federal and state dealer reports, but it does pull in some commercial vessel trip report data as well. We do think these data are fairly comprehensive. And to reiterate that this is just showing commercial landings, not recreational landings, and not subsistence harvest. There's a number of changes in this year's report compared to prior years. So we do have a bunch of new statistical analyses and data visualizations, which we'll show on later slides. And then in terms of changes in management measures over time, we did hear from Massachusetts that they had new management for false albacore, also known as little tuna or little tunny, and Atlantic bonito, and those measures started in 2025. So we're filtering out landings of those species in Massachusetts from 2025 onward. All right, jumping into the data. This is figure 1 in the report, and it takes the unmanaged landings of all the species and combines them together, showing trends over the past 20 years. So some key points here is that you can see definitely some variation year to year, but generally lower landings in recent years compared to some of the earlier years in the time series here. You can see that in 2025, total unmanaged commercial landings were about 15% lower than 2024. And this is the third year in a row of declining unmanaged commercial landings. Many species contributed to this overall decline in unmanaged commercial landings in recent years. So for example, if we were to look at all the species that had unmanaged landings in 2024, about 70% of those species had lower landings in 2025. A few species did have higher landings, but most of the species in the report had lower landings. And then Tori made this next figure to help illustrate some of those trends.
Yeah, so on this chart, you can see on the y-axis, that's the average. So these, first of all, this is the top 30 species ranked by average landings from the last 5 years. The x-axis is 2006 to 2025, and then the y-axis is the amount of landings. And that's scaled to each species so that they're comparable kind of side by side, but not in the height of the chart, just so that you can actually see them all. And so, like Julia mentioned, you can see a lot of these species, if you look in the middle of the chart, peaks in the middle showing kind of those higher landing areas. But then you can also pull out trends of some species increasing across time and some species decreasing. So it's just kind of complement to the first chart to give you a chance to look at individual species trends.
And next, I'm going to summarize some analysis that Paul Rago worked on for us. So this is another new addition this year. So like Tori mentioned in those figures, the scale of landings is pretty different across species. So we wanted to think of ways that we could look at the data where we could compare trends across species and not have the species with really high landings just kind of swamp out everything else. So one way to do a standardized comparison across species is to look at something called a Z-score. And this is calculated as the difference between the unmanaged landings in a given year and the time series average for that species divided by its standard deviation. And positive z-scores indicate higher than average landings for that species, and negative z-scores indicate lower than average landings. So this next figure is aggregating z-scores across many species. You can see the species listed out on the right. So these are those same top 30 species from the prior figures, but it's not including any of them that had confidential landings. So you can see from this figure that when we aggregate these z-scores across species, this is again showing a similar take-home message where the blue indicates negative z-scores and landings that are lower than the time series average, and then red is positive z-scores and landings that are higher than the time series average. So you can see that the most recent several years, in this case 2018 through 2025, is showing up all in blue. So that's a period of lower than average landings. Prior to that, 2012 through 2017 in red was a period of higher than average landings. And then 2006 through 2011 was mixed. And then this table shows the species that were in the top 10 for unmanaged landings each year for the most recent 5 years. This is table 2 in the report, but a little bit of a condensed version of it just to try and make it a little more legible on the screen. So species that show up in the top 10 each year for the most recent year include conchs and whelks, and we combined conchs and whelks in these reports based on input that we've received in the past about common names that might be interchangeable. Atlantic cutlassfish, sugar kelp, king whiting, other finfish, and hagfish. And we assume that the council is most interested in landings that are in the mid-Atlantic and associated with federal permits. I guess I didn't mention earlier, but these reports include landings from Maine through North Carolina in state and federal waters. So if we want to focus it on landings that might be kind of more within the council's jurisdiction, if we establish a threshold of at least 10% of landings in the most recent 5 years occurring in mid-Atlantic states and associated with federal permits, then we would highlight these two species here, Atlantic cutlassfish and king whiting, and just to provide a little bit more summary information just on those two species. For cutlassfish, in the most recent 5 years, landings averaged about 958,000 pounds per year. You can see that 2025 landings were lower than 2024. Most landings in the most recent 5 years occurred in North Carolina, and about 55% were associated with state permits. We did get some input from North Carolina DMF staff in the past, indicating that they've seen cutlassfish landings as bycatch on ocean shrimp trawls and as target species with ocean gillnets, primarily in the winter. And some summary information about king whiting is that landings averaged about 629,000 pounds per year in the most recent 5 years. This species also had lower landings in 2025, compared to 2024. About 80% of landings in the most recent 5 years were in mid-Atlantic states, again, most landings in North Carolina, and about 57% from state permits. Each year, we also look at changes in rank order over time. So if we rank the species from highest to lowest unmanaged commercial landings each year, and then look at changes in rank over time, this can help look at how the species are changing relative to each other. So these are the species that show up as having increasing or stable rank order in the most recent 5 years, which includes Atlantic cutlassfish, king whiting, other finfish, mantis shrimps, John Dory, and the toadfish family. So you can see these are some of the same species that showed up in the previous table, but some newbies. And again, if we wanted to highlight only species that had at least 10% of their landings in the mid-Atlantic and associated with federal permits, still Atlantic cutlassfish and king whiting, but also mantis shrimps and John Dory. So I summarized cutlassfish and king whiting on the prior slide. So if you want to know a little bit more about mantis shrimps, you can see that their landings averaged about 67,000 pounds per year in the most recent 5 years. This species did have higher landings in 2025 than 2024. About 60% of these landings in the most recent 5 years occurred in the mid-Atlantic, all in New York, and about 65% were associated with federal permits. For John Dory, landings averaged about 75,000 pounds per year in the most recent 5 years. Landings decreased from 2024 going into 2025. About 68% of landings in the most recent 5 years occurred in New England, and nearly all were associated with federal permits. And then Tori did this next slide.
So this so this chart is called a bump chart, and basically what you're looking at is species who are in the top 10 from the last 3 years. So the last 3 rows, how they have changed rank going back to 2016. So what this lets you do is kind of see how ranks are changing in comparison to other species. So which species are coming up into higher ranks into the top 10, species that are dropping off. So blue mussel is a good example of this. It was #1 in early years and then dropped down into the 80s in future years. And then some species kind of stay the same across time. Conchs and whelks is a good example of that. So it just kind of gives you a chance to see how these species compare in their ranks over time against each other.
And next, I'm going to summarize some time series comparisons that Paul Rago prepared for us this year. So this is the first year that we've been able to put like a real statistical analysis in our report. So we really appreciate Paul Rago helping out with this. So this is a time series comparison using randomization test to compare average landings in the most recent 5 years as a time block compared to the previous 15 years. And we could define these time periods differently if you think that would be appropriate, but we just wanted to pick something that we thought would work for this report. So we just decided to go with most recent 5 years compared to the prior 15. And what this does is it looks at a test statistic comparing the most recent 5 years to the prior 15, and then compares that to a distribution of what that test statistic would be if the values were randomly mixed up to help you determine if the pattern that you're, or the trend that you're seeing is significantly different than what you would expect to see if the result was just the result of a random process. So to get that sampling distribution, again, the values were scrambled across years and run 5,000 times to give you that distribution of what you would expect to see if it was just based on chance. And then we have a figure to visualize this. I know this is a little hard to see the details, but you can also see this in the report. This is based on the top 30 species each year, but we're only using those species that did not have any confidential landings in any of the years shown on the screen here. In future years, if we wanted to continue with this analysis, we could try to figure out how to show some information like this without compromising confidential data. So this figure is not showing the actual landings, it's showing those z-scores that I mentioned. So you can't tell the actual landings from this figure, but you can see how they kind of change over time, and the colors correspond to the z-score. So we didn't want to unintentionally give an impression of the scale of any confidential landings. So that's why we're only focusing in this table on those top 30 species that didn't have any confidential data. So each row is a species, and then the columns are the years 2006 through 2025. And then again, the colors correspond to positive z-scores in red, showing higher than average landings, and negative in blue. So you can just kind of just look at the colors to get a sense of how things have changed over time. And again, this randomization test is looking at the most recent 5 years compared to the prior 15. So that bright blue line is dividing that there. I'm sure you can't read the numbers on the screen, but on the right column, there's a value called R crit, which is the ratio of landings in the most recent 5 years compared to the prior 15. So for example, the first value there for blue mussels is 0.571, which means that on average, landings during the most recent 5 years were 57% of what they were in the prior 15 years. And then the value all the way to the right, the R crit prob value, tells us how likely that value is to be due to chance alone. So if we see values in that far right column that are less than 0.05, that indicates less than a 5% chance of seeing that ratio, a ratio higher than that due to chance alone. And if we see a value greater than 0.95, that means there's a less than 5% chance of seeing lower ratios due to chance alone. So if we wanted to highlight just those species that are kind of outside those bounds, and therefore we think this is suggesting statistically significant increases or decreases, if we first looked at those that are showing statistically significant decreases based on that metric, that highlights these species, which includes, sorry, I got to make it bigger on my own screen. Other finfish, little tunny, John Dory, white perch, oops, the dolphin fish family, harvest fish, and the harvest fish genus. So you can kind of see visually that if you look to the right of that bright blue line and the left, you see a lot more blue, darker blue on the right than on the left, which means that these species are showing, on average in those most recent 5 years, lower landings than the prior 15 years. So this is showing declines in landings. We assume that the council is less concerned about declines in unmanaged landings compared to increases. So this next slide highlights those with statistically significant increases based on that methodology, which includes cutlass fish, the ribbon fish family, silver sides, and mantis shrimps. And then I'm going to turn it over to Tori again.
Hello again. So I wanted to come up with a way of kind of creating a watch list. And so I wanted to look at kind of 3 factors. What's the growth? So what's the speed of increase for any species? The volume, so how much is being landed, and then consistency. How consistent is it year over year? So for growth, we used a linear slope, and so higher scores are greater increases. For volume, we did a log transform of 5-year average. So again, higher scores are higher landings, and then stability. You get more points if you have more year-to-year stability, and that's based off of a coefficient of variation. And so if you go to the next slide. So what that looks like is this. So you basically get a ranked list for the different species. And so it's flagging anything that warrants attention. Higher up on the list, the more attention it needs. And what you're essentially doing is taking the growth and multiplying it by 5, and the volume by 0.3, consistency by 0.2. And so that then those scores get added together, and that gives you your top score. And so that's how these species are ranked. This is also something we'd be interested in council input in as well, if there's because those weightings are just kind of something that I came up with. So if there's weights that make more sense to you all, that would be something we'd appreciate input on.
And next we have a table on landings of the forage amendment ecosystem component species. So you'll remember from an earlier slide, there's this possession limit that applies to more than 50 species that were designated as ecosystem components, but not all of those species are showing up in the landings data for maybe a variety of reasons, but what's shown here are the species that do show up in the landings data. Some key take-home messages in general across these species is you could see that landings have been generally low and variable. There's several instances of confidential data representing fewer than 3 vessels and or dealers. Of the species in this table, silver sides had the highest unmanaged commercial landings in recent years, averaging about 86,000 pounds in the most recent 5 years. And landings did increase a little bit from 2024 going into 2025. Nearly all of the unmanaged commercial landings of these species in recent 5 years occurred in the Mid-Atlantic, mostly in New York, and nearly all of those landings were associated with state permits, not federal permits. Next on the list, Atlantic thread herring landings were, as you can see, variable and confidential in some recent years. Landings were in recent years generally much lower than in the prior several years. If you look only at the most recent 5 years, most of those landings occurred in New England, but if you go farther back in time, there were some landings in the Mid-Atlantic, but those landings are pretty sporadic and variable. Round herring landings, also variable and confidential in some recent years, averaging about 14,000 pounds in recent years if we exclude confidential data. Most of those landings occurred in New England, and nearly all were associated with federal permits. Bay anchovy landings have been generally low and variable. Over the last 20 years, the highest landings in any single year was about 2,000 pounds in 2018. So that seems pretty low, but again, up to the council to decide what is of concern to you. And then the other species on this table, scaled sardines, Spanish sardines, Argentines or smelt herring, sand lances, and anchovies had either no unmanaged commercial landings or confidential levels of landings in recent years. So there's not too much we can say about them. We did want to note that there is an additional forage amendment ecosystem component species that we know there was some harvest of it last year, but I guess I should say some catch, but it's not showing up in the landings data because most of the catch was not retained, and what was retained was not sold to dealers. This was done through an experimental fishery with exempted fishing permit. So staff were in communication with the researchers on this project to better understand the catches that occurred last year. So this was a research effort led by Coonamessett Farm Foundation and several partners, including commercial fishery partners. That was a cooperative research effort. It used auto jigging machines to target neon flying squid and other squid species. So neon flying squid are a Forage Amendment ecosystem component species. Last year, they caught 417 neon flying squid and lesser amounts of other squid species. They are planning to expand upon this research effort. It's an exploratory fishing with the goals of ultimately, trying to increase their catch rates, seeing if it could be eventually a viable commercial fishery. But based on the way it was described to me, and as you can see, they only caught 417 neon flying squid. They did seem excited about their progress so far, but have a long way to go before it's ready to be a more substantial targeted fishing effort. They did this through an exempted fishing permit, which needs to be renewed each year. So they are planning to expand on this, get a new EFP to keep it going. So council staff will continue to track this research. And whenever there's a new exempted fishing permit application, there's a comment period that the council can comment on if you want. So staff will try to keep tabs on that and work with the council to submit comments as appropriate. All right, so for potential next steps for this report overall, again, we always want to hear from the council in terms of, do you think anything in here needs further evaluation? Is there any changes that you want to see for future years? And then we do have one additional analysis that I'll walk through that we put in an appendix to the report, because we wanted to present it as something that we think could be useful, but maybe should be further developed. So that's why we kind of put it here under the next steps, as opposed to in the main body of the presentation and report. So this analysis is based on a statistical process control, which is something that's used in manufacturing processes and other applications to help detect changes outside of acceptable limits. This is another analysis that Paul Rago did for us this year. So I have some figures to illustrate what it looks like, and there's a lot more figures in the appendix, but just wanted to show two kind of contrasting examples for species that have higher landings in recent years. So this is showing what it looks like for Atlantic cutlass fish, and it's still using those Z-scores that I explained before, and it's still comparing the most recent 5 years to the prior 15 years. Here, the most recent 5 years is labeled as new data, and the prior 15 is labeled as calibration data. And it's looking at variation around an expected mean. So in this case, the mean is based on the calibration data, the prior 15 years. And it's using a cumulative sum method, which measures accumulations of positive and negative Z-scores over time. And because it's looking at the accumulation of Z-scores, this helps distinguish between maybe there's a single year anomaly where something's really high or low, as opposed to something that's trending over time with more positive or negative Z-scores over time. So here, the red dots indicate instances where the cumulative sum of those Z-scores is outside the bounds around the mean. And the mean is that horizontal dark black line with the dots. So the trend line that has the red dots or black dots, black is when it's the cumulative sum is within the bounds around the mean, and then red is when it's outside the bounds. You can see either high or low. So take-home messages for Atlantic cutlass fish is that it fluctuated below the mean during that calibration period, but increased above those bounds since 2020. And you can see that the cumulative sum statistic increased to over 80 standard deviations above the calibration period. And then the ratio of the most recent 5 years compared to the prior 15 was 8.7, which means that in general, in the most recent 5 years, landings were almost 9 times higher than the previous 15. And the randomization test suggests that this is highly unlikely to be due to chance alone. So I showed on previous slides how Atlantic cutlass fish landings, they're not necessarily increasing every single year, but this is a way of looking at, again, just the trends in the most recent 5 years as a whole compared to the prior 15 years. And then a contrasting example is conchs and whelks, where you can see there's no red dots in this figure, which means that even though you can see that the cumulative sum values have been bouncing around, that they're all within the control bounds over the 20-year period, and the randomization tests suggest that there's not statistically differences in trends across this time period. All right, so we took all that information in a draft report and we sent it to the Ecosystem and Ocean Planning Advisory Panel and Committee for their review. This is something that we've been doing in recent years to help get more input on the reports, and people can flag things that they're concerned about, or maybe they have more insights into. So this year we didn't get any responses back saying that there was any concerns with anything. Several folks did say they appreciate all the additional analyses and visualizations that we've added this year. We did get one suggestion from a committee member who suggested that it could be useful to note if any of the top species are predators or prey for any council managed species. This is similar to considerations that we looked at when we were going through the forage amendment and trying to decide what species to prioritize, like do they have any links as predator or prey, or in a different way to any managed species, to help highlight things that maybe might be of more interest to the council that way. So the team of folks who worked on the report talked about that suggestion, and we agreed we didn't have time to add that in this year. But if the council wants us to look into that in future years, we could look into that, but we would definitely want to get some help from subject matter experts in diet data and consider the limitations of the available diet data. All right, we made it all the way to the last slide. Conclusions, just general take-home messages is that in general, we see declining landings of most species, declining unmanaged commercial landings in most recent years. But if we were to look at those comparisons of the most recent 5 years compared to the prior 15 with those statistical tests, we do see statistically higher landings in the recent 5 years for cutlass fish, ribbonfish, silversides, and mantis shrimp. I do want to note that we did see these landings are not beyond the levels that you saw last year, and you didn't have any concerns last year, which is, not to say that you might change your mind this year, but again, with this new addition of these statistical tests, these are some species that are kind of standing out as having higher landings in recent years compared to earlier years. And again, we'd like the council to provide guidance on any factors and methods for identifying which species warrant further consideration in the future, and anything you'd like us to further develop in the future. And that's all we had, and happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you both. I'll just start by saying Ken seemed entirely too happy in that picture. So, question, I can't, as I mentioned yesterday, I can't do reading glasses and see hands. So sorry, thank you both, and thanks to Paul for the additional analysis. I'll start with Rich, go ahead.
Thank you. It's one of my favorite reports, annual reports. For me, it would be very helpful if you could drill down on the conch species, because there aren't many conch species in the fishery species in the mid-Atlantic, and but the conchs that are there are quite different. Though if you could separate the waved whelk from the busy-con whelks, I think that would be really informative for me, because the busy-con whelks are inshore species, and the waved whelk are almost exclusive. They're exclusively federal water species. They're offshore species, and they're just extremely different animals. In fact, they're different families. I mean, it would be like lumping bluefish with summer flounder. That's how different they're in different scientific families. And for the state partners, we really are interested in the busy-con trends, the knob, the smooth, the lightning whelk. Those are all very closely related species. So that would be a suggestion. I mean, it is just a suggestion. I don't know how much extra work it would be. I think they do classify it out in the catch, the NOAA catch statistics. But thank you, and again, just thank you for this work. It was really interesting, as usual.
Yeah, just to respond to that, when in the CAMS data, when it is reported to the species level, we keep it that way. It's just that if it's reported at the family level in this case, then we were lumping conchs and whelks, just based on input we heard in the past about something, reported as conch might actually be whelk. And when reported at the species level as something like waved, knob, channeled, or lightning whelk, or some of the like species level landings, those didn't necessarily show up in the things that we're highlighting here, because when reported at the species level, they weren't like those higher levels of landings. But in the future, we could spell those out too, just so you could see what it looks like. So like when we can separate them out, we do, but there's just some instances where it's reported at a higher level. But yeah, we can look into like what we're able to show in terms of that more granular level in the future.
Okay, thanks. I got Michelle and then Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for an amazing report. I love all of the new additional visualizations and the additional analyses. I guess a couple quick things. Julia, I liked how in the presentation for the Z-scores, you had the bright blue aqua line, like just clearly delineating, the most recent 5 years from the calibration period. And that just a suggestion to include that in future versions, like of the PDF version. And then also, I think if there's a way to maybe just, I know there's a limit to how many charts and tables you want to put into this report, but maybe for the R-crit probability, if there's a way to highlight just those ones that you highlighted for us on the screen that have had a statistically significant increase or decrease, maybe just highlight that value. That would be great. And then I think I love the additional analyses that Paul did, the process control. I think especially, just thinking about like what it showed for striped mullet, like the effect of the new regulations that went into place in North Carolina. I guess the question I had about that, so all of those had a decision interval of 5 standard errors. So is that, and maybe this is a question for Paul, is that something that is selected randomly, or is that part of the calculation when you're comparing, the like the expected standard deviation, from the calibration period with those most recent 5 years? Like, how would you arrive at that decision interval? Maybe that's a question for Paul.
Yeah, I could chime in if desirable. But yeah, it is subject to user control, and usually it's related to some desired outcome or attribute of the process, or whether or not, if it was used in a industrial context, whether you're going to lose money or not. So when do you respond to a particular signal? So it's something that when do you want to be responsive, as opposed to when do you want to avoid just responding to noise? So that 5 standard deviations is one that, again, is looking at the cumulative value over time. So it's designed to detect drift. So is this thing trending upward? And then, when do you want to decide on a particular action? For species, particularly in data sets of this nature, I'm not sure if that boundary has been, really determined. So you probably need to do some analysis of some historical data just to say, okay, what do we see in terms of patterns, and then what did we actually do historically? So apologize for the long answer, but that's kind of the context in which these things are have been used in other fields.
No, I appreciate that. Paul, that's great. And I think just thinking about like continuing these analyses down the road, and so when you see those significant increases or decreases, and you're looking at how far outside a set decision interval they might be. I think, and this was part of, I guess, some of the requested input. I do think it would be helpful to understand what's the total economic value of those species, whether it's a significant increase or a significant decrease in those landings. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle.
Okay, Jim. Oh, and then Mike.
Thanks, Chairman. I know this is focused in on the commercial side of the things, and there's a great report, very good information in it. Has there ever been any consideration for recreational harvest in terms of maybe that having an impact? And I'll give 3 examples. So first off, in New York, we've got northern puffer, which you go back a couple of decades was a pretty significant recreational fishery that pretty much disappeared. And now the last couple of years, our local council, through our local council, we've been getting requests to actually manage them again because they seem to be back and they seem to be in pretty decent numbers. And they are, their range goes from, New England all the way down to Florida. So just, wondering if something along those lines. And I imagine northern puffer was in the other species maybe in terms of that list. So so that was the first example. Good to see the numbers on silver sides. They seem to be pretty significant. One of the increasing was, but like every kid that got a beach seine catches silver sides and whatever. So it could be a significant harvest with that. And then lastly, in New York, yes, we've got this mantis shrimp fishery developing that I don't even know a lot of details on it yet. But so really the question is that this does focus in on the commercial landings, but there seems to be, if we're following every other fishery we have, we could have significant increases in recreational. So is it simply we don't have data for that, or is it something that we've considered? Thanks.
We just haven't looked at that yet because so far this has just been focused on commercial landings. I think if we were to look at recreational, we would probably want to do some of our analyses differently. And, we think that the commercial landings data, they're coming from landings to dealers. We obviously think that's a lot more comprehensive than we get in concerns with the MRIP data. And if you see like a giant spike in an unmanaged species in the MRIP data, is that real or is it just an artifact of the sampling methodology? So just to note that if we were to look at recreational data, we might want to think about different ways of looking at the data, and there would be different considerations. But short answer is that the council's just asked us to focus on commercial landings in recent years.
Go ahead, Mike. Pitney.
Thanks. Great presentation. Really love all the analysis. I think the team did a great job. Can you go back to the first slide with the Z-scores that looked at the sort of global Z-scores? Just something I noted of interest. The first graph, I guess. Yeah, there we go. So 2018 is the first full year that we had the forage amendment in place with the overall possession limit. So not drawing any conclusions from that, just pointing it out that maybe a coincidence, maybe the controls on forage species had an impact, but just noting that from 2018 since we've had those negative Z-scores.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Other hands, Mike Louise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for the presentation. Can you remind me of the source of information? And I'll be transparent in that I'm thinking a lot about unmanaged commercial harvest, and in the Mid-Atlantic and in my state in Maryland, blue catfish is happening. I don't know any other way to say that. There's an enormous increase in abundance, and I'm just wondering whether or not there's a place for some summary information in this report related to the catch. And if I missed it, then I apologize. But I don't, are blue catfish anything that you guys are talking about? And I guess a lot of that information would have to come from the states. It's not going to be something that federal permit holders are having a whole lot of interaction with. And just curious as to whether conversations have been had and if that's something that we can continue to take a look at.
Yeah, I just pulled up this backup slide. I didn't mention it at all during the presentation, so you didn't miss anything. But we do pull out the non-native species and we put them in a separate table. And the reason we do that is basically because of blue catfish, because the landings are ginormous compared to the other species. So we didn't want that to like totally swamp everything else. And just based on discussions in the past, like it's probably good to see a lot of landings of blue catfish, of, you know, any of these non-native species. We would think about them differently than the other species, because if we see increasing landings of non-native species, that's probably a good thing. But landings are blowing up of a different species that might be more of concern. So I didn't mention this in the presentation, but in recent years, we have been pulling out these non-native species and putting them in a separate table and just not discussing them beyond that. But we do have the information because both the state and federal dealer reports are in CAMs, so we are able to look at, you know, things that are maybe only landed at these state dealers.
Other hands are on the table before I go to the public. I did have one question, Julie. It was on the just the other fish. I thought I saw in the report, but maybe not the presentation. Has that other fish been going down in recent years? Have we been kind of getting rid of that catch-all and getting more accurate reporting? Or
Yes, I was just pulling up the report to remind myself what I said in there. So it looks like landings in this other finfish category were higher in 2025 compared to 2024. But if we look at like a longer time period, that they have been going down, and we don't know why that is, because like we don't know like what's other and why it's reported as other. But hopefully it's improved species classification over time. But again, we don't know like what species are in that category and if they're just being reported better. I think maybe the 30 time series, it probably has a figure in there. It might be hard to zoom in on it, but I think we could show like the trends here if you can find other finfish in here. See if I can find it and tell you where it is. Yeah, so all the way over to the right, the second one down that says fish other finfish. I don't know where the pointer is or how to use it, but you can see that there was like a peak and then it's dropped a lot. So if you focus just on the most, you know, most recent years compared to the earlier years, it has gone down a lot, even if you can't really tell the scale of it here, but the landings are still kind of high compared to some other species in the report, but they have dropped off a lot. So hopefully that's improved species reporting, but you know, we didn't dig into it too much and there's probably only so much we can tell there based on how it's reported.
yeah, thank you. Well, that's encouraging, and the guilty. Just kidding. The guilty parties have their hands raised, so I'll go to Joe Grist and then Chris Bat Savage.
Not sure what I just got accused of. Tori, thanks for presenting this. Just a quick question. I forget which slide number it was, is where you're showing the change in species rank order from 16 to 25. I happen to notice in there that ranked 9th for 2025 was flounders paralichthes, and it hadn't showed up anywhere else in the graph until that point. I assume that's a data error that has popped up into the report.
Yeah, we did talk with some folks after finalizing the report, and it sounds like there is some like reporting nuances that we think this is probably just a reporting error that maybe can get figured out in the future, because so on the screen here, Paralichthes flounders is in orange, and you can see it all the way on the right. It's only showing up in 2025. So it looks like it's just dropping from 2025. If you go further in the past, it's dropping down. That's because in this report, it's really only showing up in 2025, and we think it's just a reporting issue, and it sounds like there's been some reporting nuances in the past that have been corrected. So maybe this is something that will just get corrected and like reclassified as the appropriate species in the future. So it sounds like this is not, here it looks like there's a big jump in unmanaged landings of Paralichthes flounder, but we think that's probably not a true increase. It's just a reporting issue that hasn't gotten totally squared away yet.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm still not sure what I got accused of. I'll see if Chris can deal with it.
Yeah, no, sorry, Joe. So my question was about the other fish, and there was a parens that said that it was mostly from Virginia, North Carolina. So I thought you were going to speak to that. Chris Pat Savage, go
I'll see
ahead.
if Chris wants to tackle that one. I'll blame their fleet.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. It's when you have a lot of former folks who worked in North Carolina around the table, the people might know the backstory, but I'll share it with the others. So for some of the higher volume fisheries in North Carolina, such as the fly net trawl fishery and the long haul seine fishery and the small mesh pound net fishery in the past, there's a category in our trip tickets called unclassified bait. So it was fish that really weren't marketed for food, but could have been used for bait purposes or other things. And it was literally a mixed bag of species. We would when we were doing our commercial fish house sampling, we'd get a subsample of that component of the catch, and it was sometimes it's a handful of species. It was sometimes over a dozen. They're limited to no more than 5,000 pounds landed per trip. It's gone down because the effort in those two fisheries has gone down a lot over the years. I don't know if that's exactly what you're seeing in the CAMS database, but since it was flagged for North Carolina and Virginia has had those fisheries in the past, that could be the source of the other fin fish, and if that's the case, I don't know if it would necessarily be better reporting because it's just a mixed bag of species that are used for bait and industrial purposes. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. Appreciate that. I don't see any other hands around the table. Chris, your mic is still on. Sorry. So I will look to the audience. Any members of the public? I see a couple hands online. Jim Fletcher. Jim, go ahead.
Got a question or two. If the scallop industry was to do predator control on starfish, according to this, if I'm correct, they could only land 1,700 pounds. And you did mention the lionfish, but is there a 1,700 pound limit on any unmanaged species? It's sort of odd that we are putting in controls on predatory species and non-native species, and there was on the non-native just upset. The blue catfish is native to North America for everybody's information. Something's got to be done to help start production rather than reduction in the Mid-Atlantic Council meetings. Everything I see is stop, 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 and the commercial fishing industry is declining. Thank you, United National Fishermen's Association, James Fletcher. Something's got to change.
Thanks for that comment. Yeah, just to clarify, the forage amendment possession limit of 1,700 pounds, it's only for the species and species groups shown on the screen here. So starfish are not on this list. So as far as I'm aware, there's no management measures for starfish. And the things shown in this report are not just these species on the screen here. It's meant to be everything that counts as unmanaged. So I can definitely see how that could be a little confusing, that it started with the forage amendment species, but it is expanded beyond that. So the only species and species groups that have that 1,700 pound possession limit are the ones on the screen here. So everything else is unmanaged, at least in, certain locations. There might be state management measures for some things, and that's spelled out in Appendix A. But yeah, and the non-native table, we struggled with, like, do we call it invasive? Do we call it non-native? Because there's maybe some nuances there. But yeah, appreciate those comments. Thanks.
Great, thanks. We have one other hand online. That's Kate Wilkie. Kate, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Julie, I have a question about the unmanaged forage species slide that you showed, where there were confidential landings. I believe it was for sand lance that was confidential in every year that you had shown. Is there some threshold, agreed upon threshold or number that council staff is looking for, and that you would be flagging with the council if those landings go above that level? I'm just trying to think through, how would the council know if those confidential landings were growing or at a level that was worthy of attention?
Yeah, I would love if such a threshold existed, and we've had some discussions about that in the past. I think it was 2024, maybe, we had a committee and AP meeting to talk about that, and both groups said that they didn't want to establish a specific threshold because they wanted to consider it more holistically on a case-by-case basis, and the specific threshold could vary by species. So yeah, I think it would be great if we could be able to say, like, landings are confidential, but we don't think you should be concerned about them, but we don't have that specific indication of what the council is concerned about or not. I can't remember off the top of my head what these sand lance landings looked like. I mean, like, as staff, we can look at them and provide a kind of general statement without indicating the specific scale of landings. I don't recall personally looking at those and being alarmed by them, but we don't have a specific threshold that the council has indicated that, like, would flag concern or not. And that would definitely make my job easier if that threshold existed.
Okay, thanks for that explanation. Yeah, it would make sense if you could either give some sort of general statement, or if there were a threshold, so the council could at least be aware if those numbers behind the C were of concern or just something to watch. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. That's a great question. I think, especially considering that some of these species may have niche markets, and, they may only go through a couple of dealers. It is hard to, guesstimate what the scale of these could be. I know for sand lance in particular, some of the New England states have been putting in regulations and have been reaching out to some of the Mid-Atlantic states to see if there was interest to follow suit. And I don't know how they handled presentations on the need for regulations, if they were or were not able to show landings in their particular states. But a great question, much appreciated. One more hand, and go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to follow up onto that, I mean, I think that's where the process control analysis that Dr. Rago did could be particularly helpful, even, if it's a confidential species, as long as staff can see that. And then, like Kate said, provide some general statement. I think, even though the committee and the AP preferred to not set any thresholds, that could certainly be informative and brought back to the council.
Agreed. Thank you. I don't see any other hands, so you guys stuck the landing there right on time. Well done. So we will thank you very much again. We'll move on to the next agenda item, and that's the excuse me, I'll get closer here. 2027 golden tilefish specifications. And we'll give Jose a minute to get up to the mic. And Jose, then whenever you're ready, we'll get started there.
Thank you very much. So as you indicated, we're going to be looking at the reviewing the 2027 golden tilefish specifications that were previously implemented. So that's the task for today. Here's an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to concentrate on regulatory review, stock status, and the data update that we just got from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. Then we're going to look at some recent fishery performance, and then the recommendations that came out of the SSC, the monitoring committee, and staff. So we're in the 2025-2027 specification cycle. So next year is the last year of the cycle. To develop the current specifications that we have in place, the 2024 management track assessment was used. Next year, the council will develop the specifications for the 2028 plus cycle. And for that, we will be using data update that is going to be produced next year by the center. So just to refresh your memory, these are the catch and landings limits that were implemented for the current cycle. In red there, you see management uncertainty and discard estimates that were adopted by the council. And the bottom line on that green box there at the bottom, you have the IFQ fishery quota and then the incidental fishery for the current cycle. And the bottom line is that, you know, those values are just slightly lower than what was implemented in 2024. So very, very close. So the 2024 management track assessment indicated that the stock was not overfished and overfishing was occurring in 2023. Fishing mortality was estimated at 122% of the fishing mortality threshold, and SSB was 58% of the biomass target. Now, the data update that we recently got, which is included in the briefing materials, has different figures and values up to 2025. And here on the left, you have commercial landings per unit effort. And as you know, that's the only index of abundance that we have for golden tilefish. And after hitting a recent low in 2023, large per unit landings per unit effort rebounded in 2024 and maintained a stable level through 2025. On the right, we have a bubble graph of landings by market category. And if you look at the bottom of that figure, you see that we have robust landings across all market categories in 2025. And that has continued. You have seen that in the last several years. But one thing that is noticeable is the increase in extra small fish that were landed in 2023, 2024, and 2025, which suggests a strong ongoing recruitment. So the preliminary data update that we got for 2026 aligns with the trends and projections that were developed during the management track assessment. This table shows management measures that has been implemented from 2012 to 2027. And in red there on the right, you have the commercial quotas and the commercial landings and overages and underages. But in all, for the last 3 years, the bulk of the quota has been landed. The bulk of the landings for this fishery come from bottom long line gear with 96% of the total landings, and second largest gear type is bottom auto troll with less than 1% of the landings. Statistical areas 616, 537, and 622 accounted for 97% of the total landings in 2025. And when it comes to ports, landing ports, 98% of the landings came from 4 ports, with Montauk being number 1 with 58%. And then we have Barnegat Light, Hampton Bays, and Point Judith at a distant 4th place. So graphically, the landings by statistical areas, you can see that the bulk of those landings, close to over 90%, came from 2 statistical areas, 616 and 537. And that's typically where we see the bulk of the landings come out on a yearly basis. 1.6 million pounds of golden tilefish were landed. This is landed weight in 2025, and that represented a 7% increase from the prior year. And the ex-vessel revenue for those landings was $7.3 million, a 12% increase from 2024. In all, 148 vessels landed golden tilefish in 25, and 54 dealers purchased those animals. And the mean price per pound in 2025 was $4.49, and that's a 5% increase from the prior year. So this graph here comes from Garfo, from their weekly quota report. And as the beginning of June, you see the blue line there that is tracking landings. And basically, at the end of that line, we see that about 38,000 pounds of golden tilefish has been landed incidentally, and that's about 55% of the quota. So in all, this year, we're just tracking a little bit below what was done last year at the same time period. Here we have incidental landings from 2013 to 2025. In 2025, 64,000 pounds of golden tilefish were landed by the incidental component of the fishery, and that represented 93% of the incidental quota. Now, when it comes to bycatch, these are non-target species, and these are values for 2025, and this comes from CAM's data. And these are tilefish trips that accounted for at least 75%, that had at least 75% of golden tilefish on those trips. So these are directed trips. And we see that the largest bycatch was spiny dogfish at 2.8% of the total catch for those directed trips. And then we have smaller amounts of blueline, smooth dogfish, and conger eel. Now, regarding the recreational fishery, as you all recall, you may recall there was a recreational catch time series that was developed for the 2024 management track assessment. And these values are generated using vessel trip report data, large pelagic survey data, and other historical information. And the details on how these values were estimated are presented in the 2026 data update. But in all, we see that in 2025, about 78,000 pounds of golden tilefish were landed by the recreational sector, and this accounted for 4.2% of the total removals of for the fishery. Now, regarding, I'm going to give you now a quick update on the survey for golden tilefish. Remember that we had a pilot project for blueline tilefish and golden tilefish in 2017. Then we had 2 dedicated golden tilefish surveys, one in 2020 and the other one in 2023. We were supposed to have another survey last year, but that was postponed due to budgetary uncertainties. And the survey is being conducted right now, actually, as we speak. I think that they went out on June 14. So they have been fishing for a few days, and things are going well. Now, we met with the advisors at the beginning, mid-April, and we asked a series of trigger questions that we asked for all our fisheries, and I'm going to go over some of the comments that we received. One thing to note is that the advisors, they like to have status quo quotas because they provide stability in the market and prices. The advisors indicated that the prices for tilefish are very robust and stable. They have there's not much variability from year to year, which is good. Industry continues to report that windy conditions have impacted fishing operations, not only the timing, but the duration of those trips. And typically, several advisors indicated that typically they go out and fish for a specific poundage of animals. And those trips tend to last between 10 and 12 days. That's how long they're gone. But given really adverse weather conditions, a lot of times they just have to come back to port because it's just way too windy, the currents are too strong, the fish are not biting, so they come back to port and then they go out again to finish catching whatever amount of fish they were targeting initially. So the industry thinks that this is something that is probably impacting the landings per unit effort right now. Also, barn door and winter skates are also impacting fishing and the landings per unit effort. The advisors also indicated that they have some concerns regarding the way the recreational data has been, time series has been developed. They just want to be sure that people understand that those are just estimates. They also reported a good mix of fish sizes and quantity and large amounts of small fish. And we can see that on the bubble graph that I just showed you. So they're reporting exactly what we're seeing on the data. And they also indicated that they are observing a new year class that is starting to recruit into the fishery in late 2025 and early 2026. For higher trips have also been impacted by bad weather and high fuel prices. If they don't have enough customers to compensate for that increase in fuel prices, they're just canceling trips. Multiple AP members indicated that captains and crew members should be included in the commingled bag limit. And they also indicated concerns about the lack of biological sampling of landings on the dock. And they're asking if more observers could help with this specific task. So we have seen these two comments made by the AP for the last 3 or 4 years. Now, regarding the SSC recommendation, the SSC review all the data that I have provided you for this meeting. And given the evidence of incoming year class, the broad range of size classes that are available, the stock dynamics are following the trends and predictions from the stock assessment. And also that even though there have been adverse fishing conditions, the bulk of the quota has been landed. So given all these different factors, the SSC recommended no changes to the 2027 ABC previously derived. Monitoring committee also reviewed the same information and they recommended no changes for 2027. So we continue to recommend that the catch, the recreational catch be accounted under management uncertainty. No changes to the discards by sector. and no changes to the recreational bag limit or incidental trip limit. And finally, we have staff recommendations to Dr. Chris Moore. And based on the information that I just presented to you, the staff recommended no changes to 2027 specifications either. And that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you very much, Jose. Do we have any questions on the presentation or comments on the recommendations from council? Go ahead, Lori.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A comment more, Jose, on your slide 19, I'm sorry. On the indicated concern about the lack of biological sampling of landings on the dock, more observers may help. I feel like on that topic, we have good observer, well, we had good observer coverage. Recently, maybe it's declined slightly, but my understanding is it's going to pick up again. So we have very good observer coverage on the trips. So the question was, is there a way to integrate the observer data with the shoreside biological sampling because of the decline in the shoreside sampling? Because there is such good observer coverage. So I would hope that perhaps we could work in a direction. I know it's apples and oranges, the way it's collected, but if down the road there's a way either to integrate or perhaps to have the observer data take over that sampling because the coverage is so high, so that we don't come up with a shortage of the biological sampling in going forward for stock assessment purposes.
Thanks, Lori. Mike has his hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. John's not here to address this, but it's an easy answer in the sense of at 1:30 today, KB McCardle from the Science Center, who runs the NEFOP program and that with that the division that with the NEFOP program is within, is going to talk about her division. And one of the major initiatives over the last couple of years, which you may have heard us discuss, is integrating the sea sampling program that used to be run from Garfo on a contract that we ran into that program, into her division and her programs. And so you can ask that specific question if she doesn't cover it directly. But that's exactly what what she's gonna talk about, is that they're leveraging the observer program to increase the opportunities for sea sampling, port sampling.
Yeah, thank you for covering that, Mike. I appreciate that, and that is something to look forward to. Any other hands? Joe Grist.
Jose, thanks for the presentation. Is it possible, and knowing we have this coming up this afternoon too, but would it be possible, even after this meeting, to get a comparison of landings versus state versus where we are and are not getting the biological sampling, so that maybe in certain situations for port sampling, even the states can jump in and help out and catch some of the boats at dock and get, as they're offloading, we might be able to help with some of the biosampling. If there's not an observer on the trip, we may still be able to pick them up at the dealer and get that information to help out.
Yeah, I think as Mike pointed out, John's not here, but that was something that the states, through ASMFC for some other species in particular, have been discussing with the Science Center, and maybe that's something for a further discussion a little later on too. Any other hands? Not seeing any. Any questions from the public? Still not seeing any hands. All right. Thank you, Jose. And I guess I did have that open, so just to make sure then, right, let's get some clarity that there are no concerns with staff recommendation of not seeing any. Okay, so staff recommendation to stay status quo. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And before we move to our next agenda item, let's take a a break. Why don't we do 15 minutes and everybody try to get back in 15 minutes? Not saying anything about yesterday, but we went a little long. All right. Thank you. Okay, folks, let's get started. And we are back with the 2027 through 2029 Blueline Tilefish specifications. Looks like Hannah's ready to go. So Hannah, take it away, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so similar to golden tilefish, but slightly different, we'll be setting specs for Blueline for the next 2 years. So in terms of the presentation today, first, I'll go over recent stock status and fishery performance. Then we'll get into the advisory panel feedback and that 2026 fishery performance report. Then I'll pass it over to Dr. Rago to provide the SSC discussion and recommendation. And then I have a series of slides that get into the monitoring committee recommendations. And then more as a FYI, I also have a few slides to provide a brief update on the on the subcommittee that we created with the South Atlantic Council on those discussions there. And then the overall objectives for today is to come up with a recommendation for catch and landing limits for 2027 through 2029 and review and recommended changes to the commercial or recreational management measures if needed. So diving right in for Blueline, the most recent assessment conducted was CDAR 92. It was completed in March of last year. So if you remember, Blueline is assessed a little differently than our other stocks. It's assessed through the CDAR process, so the South Atlantic process. We got a presentation from Nikolai. He was the stock assessment lead last year, explaining that this was an operational assessment. So through this process, no major updates to the model or analysis were conducted, and it was essentially an update using the most recent catch information to what was done back in 2017 through CDAR 50. This assessment, like the previous assessment, split the stock into a northern and southern region at Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. For the portions of the stock south of Cape Hatteras, an aspect model was initially used. However, at the April 2025 South Atlantic SSC meeting, that model was not recommended for management, and instead they used a data limited model toolkit to estimate a total allowable catch or TAC. For the stock north of Cape Hatteras, so this is including our portion of the stock, that the same DLM toolkit was used. It was updated from what was done in CDAR 50, and similarly to that South Atlantic DLM toolkit, it estimated a TAC for the northern region separately. To give a little overview of the Blueline fishery in the Mid-Atlantic, last year the Council approved specifications just for 2026. These specifications were informed by that updated DLM toolkit and included an ABC of 452,200 pounds. Based on the allocations in the fishery management plan, 27% of that ABC is allocated to the commercial fishery and 73% to the recreational fishery. In the past, the sector-specific ACLs have been set equal to the ACTs, and then sector-specific projected discards are then subtracted from those ACTs to get the total allowable landings for each sector. The commercial fishery for Blueline is open year-round or until 100% of that TAL is landed, and the position limit is initially set at 500 pounds gutted weight at the start of the year, and then there's a step down to 300 pounds once 70% of that TAL is landed. For the recreational fishery, the season opens starting May 15th through November 14th, and the recreational trip limit varies depending on mode. This table shows the ABC and the commercial and recreational catch and landing limits since 2019. Notably, management measures for Blueline have remained largely unchanged since then. However, there have been minor adjustments to the commercial TAL in 2021, 2024, and 2025, and again this year due to landing overages, which, based on the Blueline accountability measures, does require a pound-for-pound payback in the following year. In 2025, the commercial fishery just slightly exceeded the ACL by about 3%. And I do want to note in this table, it includes all of the updated CAMS landings. So there might be slight deviations in the table here shown today compared to last year's. So I just wanted to note that sometimes you'll see larger ACL overages here compared to last year, or even smaller ACL overages or no ACL overages. So I just wanted to note that. As for the recreational fishery, the landings in this table are estimated using that Delphi method and the for hire VTR data, which I'll explain a little more later in detail. But since 2019, based on these estimates, the recreational landings have only slightly exceeded the ACL once by about 0.3%. And then, as I noted on the previous slide, we approved specifications for 2026. As you'll notice, that ABC notably increased compared to our past limits, and then resulting in a higher commercial quota as well as a higher recreational TAL. But keep in mind, recreational, we transitioned to different data sources, so that higher limit might not truly be reflective of a higher quota and more be a change of frame of reference. So jumping into the commercial fishery performance, landings were low and relatively stable under 20,000 pounds through the 2000s up until 2014. And as many of you are aware, this peak in landings really drove the initial involvement of the council into the Blueline fishery. Since the council established management for Blueline through an emergency rule in 2015, landings have remained relatively constant with small peaks in 2020 and 2023. In 2025, we did see a slight decline in landings compared to 2024, but remember there was a pound for pound bait back, so that decline is likely attributed to that smaller quota that they were operating off of. And in 2025 specifically, the commercial fishery caught about 21,700 pounds. This is the current fishing year. This figure is pulled directly from the Garfo quota monitoring website, which shows the commercial quota at the top in red, and that dashed red line represents 70% of the quota. So when that trip reduces from 500 to 300 pounds. The final rule for 2026 catch and landing limits was just published late last week, and those measures were implemented Monday. So this graph was pulled this morning. The blue line is the current year landings to date, which as you can see are trending just slightly above that yellow line, which are last year's landings. And then that solid green line here is that quota rationing trajectory, which just visually shows the trend in landings spread evenly throughout the season that would allow the fishery to meet but not exceed the quota, which you can see we are well under given that increase in the commercial quota. Last year, the commercial landings exceeded the commercial quota, and the fishery was shut down in November, and there was a very minor payback by about, I think it was 600 pounds. Before I dive into the recreational fishery and landings, I wanted to first highlight some of the key differences in the recreational data currently used for management and what was used in CDR 50 compared to what was used in CDR 92, so that updated assessment. As many of you know, in the past decade or so, we've been relying on the Delphi method to estimate private recreational landings each year, which assumes private recreational landings is equivalent to 105.16% of charter reported landings. We have also been using an average 3.65 pound multiplier, which came from a carcass donation program conducted by Old Dominion to convert the recreational landings in number of fish to pounds, which as you can see from the details provided in the green box here, through CDR 92, there is a deviation in these previous sources, and instead CDR 92 incorporated private recreational MRIP landing estimates in pounds and MRIP estimated discards, which were then converted to pounds using the mean weight derived from MRIP landings data, which ranged from about 4.5 to 5.5 pounds. So quite the increase compared to that 3.65 pounds. As for charter and headboat landings, CDR 92 again incorporated VTR data, but because we don't have for hire specific fish weights, those numbers were converted to pounds by applying the average mean weight of MRIP, which was just over 5 pounds. However, because the 2025 ABC and resulting catch and landing limits were set based off of CDR 50, the table shown here estimates recreational landings using that Delphi method and the for hire VTR data, and then in the last column converted to pounds using that 3.65 average pound multiplier. So if we look at the lower right-hand corner of this table, you'll see that recreational landings in 2025 were estimated to be just under 50,000 pounds, which is lower in comparison to what we've seen in the past several years. And then this graph shows the estimated recreational landings in pounds. The dashed pink line uses the methods I showed in the table on that previous slide. And the solid black line is the 2025 ACL. So looking at 2025, you can see estimated harvest was below the recreational ACL. And then if you look back through 2019, you can see we've been kind of dancing up and down around that ACL, which has been the same since 2019. And then the green line represents recreational landing estimates using the recreational data incorporated in CDAR 92. I added this really just for comparative purposes to visually show the differences in the trend. And this is also what we'll have to start using come 2026, since that new ABC is based off this data as opposed to the Delphi method and the previous data used. So just wanted to highlight the key differences here. As Jose mentioned, we met with our Tilefish advisory panel to talk through their on-the-water observations to get an idea of any feedback they may have on our 2 managed tilefish species. For this first slide, there were a few comments regarding both Blueline and Golden, specifically in regards to the recreational data and the private recreational permitting and reporting requirements. One advisor noted that he was happy to see details about the private recreational permit and reporting requirements being added to multiple GARFO web pages, but is disappointed to yet see those details added to the HMS website. Multiple advisors also expressed disbelief in the MRIP estimates for both tilefish species and noted that such information should not be used in stock assessments or for management, given the high level of uncertainty associated with the annual estimates. One advisor reported a continued northward and eastward expansion of Blueline tilefish range. He noted seeing new colonies in areas where Blueline had not previously been encountered, and that these colonies appear to be establishing consistent footholds in these new locations. He noted that this observation was particularly evident during the 2025 fishing year, and that he noticed 1 or 2 new colonies that he hadn't seen before. And then advisors expressed optimism with this apparent range expansion. Advisors were also happy with the proposed 2026 increase in the commercial fishery and were optimistic that this increase would prevent future early in-season closures. They also highlighted that discards associated with the early fall loligo squid fishery was not as much of a concern in 2025 compared to the previous 2 years. They expressed that this was because in 2025, the fishery didn't close until November, and the height of that loligo fall fishery usually happens in September and early October. So because of this, they question if the current 10% reduction from the ACT to get the projected discards to derive the commercial quota was still appropriate. So they asked the monitoring committee to take that into consideration. There were also a few comments on the commercial possession limit. 2 advisors expressed interest in observing how the fishery reacts to the increased commercial quota before recommending any changes to that 500-pound possession limit. They expressed concern that raising the limit prematurely could attract increased effort and new participation, and there was also uncertainty if the higher quota level would be sustained long-term. And they didn't want to see a reactive increase followed by a later decrease. There were also comments specific to the recreational fishery. One advisor out of New Jersey noted that the for-hire vessels by him have adapted their fishing behavior in response to the May 15th season start date that was implemented a few years back. He noted that vessels going out in the early spring are fishing in areas where they primarily catch only golden tilefish to avoid incidentally catching blue lines, but that there still remains a strong interest to modify that season back to the original May 1 start date for the northern region. So New Jersey North. One advisor also noted concerns with MRIP estimates, particularly for the private rental mode, and highlighted that the annual estimates for Blueline are implausibly high, especially given the small 3 fish bag limit that is currently in place for private recreational anglers. And then just as a reminder, the council has been supporting a portion of the SADL, or the South Atlantic Deepwater Longline Survey. This is a cooperative survey with industry participants that focuses on deepwater snapper grouper species. This survey was initially started in 2020 in waters off of the Florida Keys to the North Carolina-Virginia border, and later expanded northward in 2023 to about Delaware Bay. And the council has supported this expansion each year since then. We are also expecting the survey to sample the full range again in 2026, and the full range is shown here on the map with that mid-Atlantic portion highlighted in the purple color. And then the table on the left here shows the total number of Blueline caught each year in the survey, as well as the total number of hauls and hooks retrieved. And then we also have CPUE shown as catch per haul and catch per hook retrieved in the last 2 rows. These CPUEs are based on the raw numbers, but if folks are interested, I do have the CPUEs based off the stratified mean, which incorporates total sampling area with the associated CVs, which was a big part of the SSC conversation that Dr. Rego will get into more detail on. Based on the raw values, the CPUs presented here, though, as you can see in 2025, those values did go down compared to the previous 2 years. But if you look at the length frequency graph on the right, the trend in the size of fish caught was relatively consistent across the 3 years. We also only have 3 years of data at this point for this survey, so it might not be long enough to truly understand the long-term trends. And as I mentioned, during the SSC meeting, the group had a lengthy discussion on how to interpret the saddle data in the past 3 years and this decline in 2025, which Dr. Rego will get into more detail on. But before I pass the mic over to Dr. Rego, I just wanted to remind the group that a subgroup of the Mid-Atlantic and South Atlantic SSC met last year to discuss the updated DLM toolkit. This group had a number of tasks listed in their meeting terms of reference, including peer reviewing that DLM toolkit, provide recommendations to the full SSCs on an OFL and/or ABC, and then provide a scientifically derived method to apportion the ABC between the 2 council jurisdictions. Ultimately, this group felt that because the DLM used a catch-based approach, that they could not recommend an OFL and instead recommended an ABC for the stock north of Cape Hatteras, be equivalent to one of the management procedures outputs from that DLM. And the management procedure that they selected was essentially the median estimated removals of fish based on the most recent 5-year average. They also recommended that the ABC be proportionally split using a similar approach that was used back in 2018 following CDAR 50, but using updated survey information, so the 2023 and 2024 saddle data that they had. This resulted in 70% of the ABC going to the Mid-Atlantic and 30% of that ABC going to the sliver, which is that South Atlantic region between the North Carolina-Virginia line and Cape Hatteras. So the table at the bottom here shows the resulting recommendations from this SSC subgroup. And at this point, I will pass it over to Paul for his report.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hannah. Next slide, please. Yeah, the bottom line is that SSC determined that the new information was really insufficient to alter our previous recommendation from 2025, and therefore we recommend continuing the 205 tons as an ABC for the period 2027 to 2029. Anna's done a nice job of outlining the basis for that decision. It includes a review of the South Atlantic Deepwater Longline Survey, the commercial data received to date, and then perspectives from the AP. Unlike our recommendation last year, which was a 1-year recommendation, we are recommending a full 3 years. I fully appreciate the implications of our previous decision on that basis, but again, it was a period where we were increasing the ABC about 4.5 times, and there was the saddle survey was underway at that point. So just by way of recall as to why we're revisiting it this year. Next slide, please. In terms of the survey itself, it's desirable that we would like to see this survey continue. It has a lot of potential. Longline surveys are used for a variety of species around the world and are used on a routine basis, particularly on things like halibut. We did note that there was a 40% decline. Hannah showed you those data in 2025, and that relative to the previous 2 years. Right now, it's difficult to determine if this is a true decrease or just noise. We heard earlier with respect to golden tilefish about how weather affects performance of the commercial fishery. Those same features could have implications for the conduct of this particular survey. So it's really hard to separate what might be called design error from sort of a non-design error, things that arise due to Mother Nature. We did have a list of recommendations for computing additional statistics from the survey. In particular, something like percent positive tows might be a way of sort of conditioning information, which at first blush suggests a large decline, but if there's, say, a fairly high number of positive tows, it may simply be uncontrollable non-design or non-survey error. There's a lot of uncertainty in this assessment. Next slide. A lot of moving parts. So there's really, at this point, a lack of sufficient data to conduct an analytical assessment. You need at least 5 years worth of data, and even that's would be kind of stretching it. So these conditions that we're operating under now are likely to continue for several more years, or maybe 5 to 10 years before there's enough information to really start putting some stronger inference in the modeling. There's a lot of uncertainty in the recreational catch estimation. Hannah's highlighted much of that and the perspectives of the AP. There's also the pending change with respect to calibration, which may have some downstream effects. And then, of course, this is a relatively rare species in the scheme of things. So a lot depends on that kind of low frequency sampling that occurs. Current data limited approaches rely pretty heavily on a lot of life history knowledge, which is hopefully always increasing, but also sort of a concept of stationarity that we have something where we're more or less assuming a constant environmental set of conditions in order to apply those models. Now, that clearly may not be the case with respect to the habitat of blueline tilefish. The survey data, again, to emphasize the effect of non-survey factors versus true population changes. So that's a big source of uncertainty. And then the SSC did recommend continuing sort of the interim metrics until the next assessment, until the next decision point. These would be annual review of the saddle results, length frequencies, and then, if possible, any changes in commercial landings by stat areas. This is follow up on the information that fishermen reported that they were finding new colonies where they had not previously found them. And then finally, our last slide is just on our research recommendations. We expressed, support for continuing the Deepwater Longline survey. Had a few suggestions in terms of recreational catch. These are fairly technical kinds of things, and also would require buy-in and investment in terms of something, more targeted subsampling from the license list. The issue of commercial sampling is, of course, important because of the getting those biological attributes. And, the whole idea, if you're going to do this, it has to be done in a statistical context, but it also has to recognize that these are pretty rare events. So it will need some sort of focused attention if we're truly going to make some advances here. And then, of course, finally, getting a better measure of aging growth is kind of central to getting an age-based stock assessment. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Hannah, and appreciate the opportunity to summarize the SSC comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Rago. So on this slide, sorry.
They say, call me Paul here. That's a lot of extra still syllables you don't need. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So on this slide is the flow chart that displays how the landing limits are then calculated from the SSC recommended ABC. So as I mentioned earlier, for Blueline, 27% of that ABC goes to the commercial ACL and 73% to the recreational. From there, we'll need to discuss management uncertainty for each sector and determine whether to recommend applying a buffer from the ACL to the ACTs. And then we'll discuss expected dead discards for each sector, and we'll need to recommend an amount to be subtracted from each sector ACT to derive the TALs. So the calculation for the ACLs is pretty straightforward and just applies the FMP allocations to the ABC. So this results in a commercial ACL of 122,094 pounds and a recreational ACL of 330,106 pounds. Moving on to the sector's ACTs, the council should consider whether to recommend a deduction from the commercial and/or recreational ACLs to account for management uncertainty. In the past, the monitoring committee for either sector. Some things to consider related to the commercial fishery. It is well monitored, and GARFO has in-season closure authority. The accountability measures also require a pound-for-pound payback during the following fishing year, which has been implemented in years where those overages have occurred. And this year, the monitoring committee agreed that the commercial fishery does not need any sort of buffer, just given the details described above. But they did express interest in tracking commercial landings and discards more closely moving forward and incorporating a management uncertainty buffer if warranted in the future, especially given that large increase that we're seeing in 2026. As for the recreational fishery, the catch is not as well controlled given data lags, and there is no in-season closure authority. There's a high level of uncertainty associated with MRIP estimates, as we have discussed over and over again. But the AMs do require a pound-for-pound payback if an overage occurs. This year, the monitoring committee acknowledged the high degree of uncertainty associated with the MRIP. However, they also noted the significant shift in how recreational catch will be estimated given the new ABC and how that was calculated. They emphasized the importance in first observing the fisheries response to these changes before implementing any additional buffers, and they highlighted that the 2026 recreational ACL is not a substantial increase, unlike the commercial ACL, given the shift in the Delphi method to MRIP, and that it's more of a frame of reference change. Getting to discards from the ACTs, the council should consider recommending expected dead discards for the recreational sector as well as the commercial sector. In 2025, the monitoring committee recommended a 2% discard rate for the recreational fishery and a 10% discard rate for the commercial fishery. This recommendation was based on the available private recreational MRIP and for hire VTR data, as well as the commercial trawl discard information available through CAMS. So this discard data and for hire VTR discard data. And in that middle column, we've applied the 82% discard mortality rate used through CDR 92. In the majority of the time series, total recreational discards accounts for less than 2% of total catch, which you can see on the right-hand column. However, when you look at the time series average, dead discards accounts for slightly more than that at about 5% of total catch. The monitoring committee talked about this at length and ultimately recommended using the time series average, so that 5% given the majority of years when discards were less than 2% represents years where MRIP recreational discards were estimated to be 0 fish, mostly attributed to 0 intercepts during that year with discards. The monitoring committee discussed the high variability year to year driven by those MRIP or intercept rates and felt that using a multi-year average would help dampen those annual fluctuations, but at the same time still scale with the overall catch estimates used to derive the recreational catch limits. During the discussion, the monitoring committee also acknowledged that for catch accounting purposes, the projected estimated discards used to derive the TALs will have really no impact on assessing ACL overages. So they ultimately recommended moving towards that averaging approach and agreed using an average from the longer time series as opposed to just a few years would be appropriate. For the projected commercial discards in 2025, the monitoring committee recognized that the previously used 1% discard rate was no longer appropriate given the new data available through CAMS. Like last year, the monitoring committee walked through the CAMS estimates in detail and raised several concerns, specifically with the high CVs associated with those estimates and the low number of observed trips, and the fact that CAMS borrows discard rates from prior years when observed trips are too few. For gear types like long lines and hand lines, the committee felt these concerns were significant and still applied again this year, but they acknowledged that the trawl-based estimates were viewed more favorably given the higher observer coverage and lower associated CVs, and the trawl discards is what is shown here on the table. The committee also flagged that the early commercial fishery closures in 2023 and 2024, and again in 2025, as well as the past advisory panel comments during those years regarding the higher than normal discards driven by that fall Loligo squid fishery occurring during the height of that fishery. And they also felt that 2025, given it closed early, should be excluded from this discard estimate. So for all those reasons, the monitoring committee landed on using the trawl-only dead discards averaged across 2017 through 2022, which arrives at that 10% commercial discard rate that they used last year. And then this slide just breaks down the catch and landing limits from that ABC to the monitoring committee recommended sector-specific ACLs, ACTs, and the approach for calculating dead discards, resulting in a commercial TAL recommendation of 109,885 pounds and a recreational TAL of 313,601 pounds. But before we get into today's discussion, I just also wanted to provide a brief update on that joint Mid-Atlantic and South Atlantic Blueline Tilefish subcommittee that was established. Just as a reminder, this group was established to address the jurisdictional allocation of the Blueline ABC north of Cape Hatteras, given some of the disagreement on the 70%, 30% recommended split from the joint subgroup of the SSE process last year. The goal of this group is to formalize the jurisdiction allocation and establish a management process for setting and updating the allocation moving forward. This group discussion will likely feed into a future council management action and future specification cycles, but it is not the intent to impact the council discussion or objectives for today. So the 2027 through 2029 specification cycle, this is again for the future. This subcommittee is made up of 3 council members and 1 SSC member from each council. And the subcommittee met for the first time on May 1st, which was intended to be an initial kickoff meeting and was focused on first reviewing the 2018 and 2025 process and how we went about proportioning that ABC between the 2 councils. During the meeting, we also reviewed different allocation approaches for other species to understand some of the decisions each council has made for other stocks and to help inform future discussions of this group. And then last, we discussed the information we currently have available for Blueline Tilefish and what information might be useful to look at for this allocation decision. Just to focus on some of the high-level takeaways, the subcommittee expressed interest in exploring a sort of rubric design with some kind of weighting method to be able to incorporate not only the available saddle survey information, but also landings information, economic information, and if possible, community level indicators. During the discussion, this subcommittee also highlighted the many caveats associated with the Blueline Tilefish information, as well as the differing management measures, accountability measures, and even the inherent differences in the fisheries between the 2 different boundaries. And that through this process, it's important to keep those caveats in mind when forming a recommendation. The plan is for this group to reconvene again virtually across 2 half-days on July 20th and July 22nd. And during this next meeting, the goal will be for the group to recommend a method to allocate the ABC between the 2 councils, as well as a framework to adjust such allocation in the future. So getting back to the focus of today's discussion, just a reminder, the goal is for us to adopt Blueline specifications for the next 2 years, and if desired, recommend any changes to the commercial and recreational measures, and those measures are outlined at the bottom. And just so everyone knows, the monitoring committee also recommended no changes to the recreational or commercial measures based on AP feedback, and given 2026 is the first year where we're seeing this increase in the ABC. And with that, I can pass it back to you, Mr. Chair, and take any questions at this point.
Great, that was a lot. I really appreciate that. Actually, a lot of thank yous to go out. So thank you to Paul, to the SSC subgroup, and to the SSC in general. I know this is a tough species to make recommendations on, considering, just how tenuous of information coming out of that assessment is. But I'll take the liberty of making the first comment, which is I really appreciate the AP decision there to kind of sit and wait on this, not knowing if those higher levels will stick around or not. So I apologize. I lost my screen for a minute, so I can look around the room to see if there's any hands or questions, but maybe Skip could help me out if there's any hands online. So questions or comments? I see Michelle's hand is up. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Hannah, for a really thorough presentation and reminding us of everything that's transpired with this particular species lately. I guess, I know in the AP report, the comment about, inclusion of the Tilefish reporting requirements, private Tilefish reporting requirements on the HMS website, and it notes that HMS staff expressed concerns about creating a precedent for other council species. I was wondering if you might be able to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, we've talked with the HMS staff over the course of several years, asking them to add that language and trying to emphasize that this situation is a little bit different than I think some of their concerns about other councils. So their thought process is, if we do this for the mid and for Tilefish, what's to stop the South Atlantic Council from requesting us to add information about dolphin wahoo, which also are commonly caught on shark trips or highly migratory species trips as well. So I think they're just a little concerned about if we do this for one council and make this exception, do we have to do this for all councils? And there's a lot of overlap with not only the tilefish fishery and HMS, but also dolphin wahoo and some of those other species as well.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't seem like it would be too much trouble to add just, a couple lines of hyperlinked code to, take someone back to the Mid-Atlantic Council's website. And I mean, I understand that, dolphin fish are also caught on those HMS trips, but I would think that the HMS staff would be supportive of, improving the quality of the information and reminding people that, these are, this is a requirement to report, particularly for tilefish. So I guess I'm disappointed in that response. Thanks.
Last year, that's the comment we got from them. We can try again this year, but I can't promise that it will result in any different outcome.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a follow-up to that, Hannah, remind me, was that a formal request or is that you just having a conversation with HMS staff?
Last year you sent in, I think we went to the route of you sending an email and we got the same sort of response. So coming from you would be a little bit more formal, but we've tried multiple avenues, but we can try again this year.
Yeah. So given that, if the council agrees, we could try that. I can send a letter, from the council indicating, our interest in having this happen. Try again. So if everyone agrees, we'll do that. Okay.
Okay. Seeing head nods and no objections, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's a somewhat unique situation, considering, as I've said many times, with in the absence of good MRIP estimates, the need for reporting is incredibly important here. Other hands around the table? Not seeing any. Hannah, do you know the kind of the status of the aging and I guess the comfort level of ages maybe making it into a new assessment?
Yeah, so last year there was a topical working group made during that CEDAR 92 process that focused on that specifically. It seems like there is still some a little bit of hesitation to using the aging information. South Carolina DNR they use a bomb carbon radio. I'm going to get this so wrong. Bomb carbon radio method to age blueline tilefish, and they have been successful, but there is some variability depending on reader. So what South Carolina DNR staff has been getting, and they published a paper that was released, I believe, 2 years ago at this point. The Southeast Science Center, their staff is not necessarily getting the same reading. So I think there is still some variability and differences there, but we did incorporate the new age information or the recent age information in that DLM toolkit. It's not incorporated in the way as like a formal assessment does, but it does inform two of the management procedures as a result of that. But unfortunately, last year, those management procedures that included life history information were inconclusive, so we couldn't actually move forward with them. But it seems like those conversations are still hoping, and hopefully the next CEDAR assessment will be a benchmark. And so that would be the opportunity to really dive deep into that and hopefully make or come up with a solution. But I know it's something that they're still working on, and South Carolina still stands by the method that they're using, and we're catching the blueline that we're catching. We're doing aging on through the saddle work, and so we're getting that information each year as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I always get the carbon dating wrong as well, and hopefully either Dr. Jones or my wife are listening. So, any other hands? No. Okay. So You know, we are looking for a motion here. We have some recommendations coming forward, and I don't know, Hannah, if we have a draft motion. We do. Great. So I'll look around the room. Joe, go ahead.
I'll make the motion. Move to adopt Blueline Tilefish specifications for 2027 to 2029. For 2027 to 29, the commercial ACL equals ACT equals 122,094 pounds, with a commercial TL of 109,885 pounds. The recreational ACL equals ACT equals 330,106,000 pounds, with a recreational TL of 313,601,000 pounds.
Thanks, Joe. Better you than me. We have a motion. Do we have a second? Jim. Okay. Jim Gilmore, thank you. I'll look for discussion on the motion around the table, and then I do see a hand online, so I'll go to the public after that. But let's stay at the table first. Discussion on the motion, Michelle.
And remind me, I know Dr. Rega mentioned this, but sorry, Paul mentioned this, but the MRIP recalibration, when are we supposed to get that again? So that might be the one thing that would change this during revisitation of 2027 to 2029, right?
Yeah, Jason or someone who is more involved with that than I can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe we'll see those values this fall, but then they'll be incorporated into the stock assessments like summer flounder, scup, black sea bass come next year.
Yeah, I think that's pretty close. Hannah, I think the last I heard, August is a hopeful date to get it out. I don't, you know, it may be a little bit later for how that starts to get incorporated. And I believe, Chris, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So Hannah, don't forget, we probably had this conversation, but I forget what how we where we ended up. But we have this new subcommittee, and they're going to start meeting, or they've already met. They're going to meet again. So how are they going to impact specifications? The first year that they're actually going to have an impact on specifications is 28, or is it after these?
So it depends on what route the council ends up taking, but I think the thought process is to formalize this allocation. So to put it in rules, and I'm not sure how that's going to work out just yet. I'll have to work with Garfo and South Atlantic staff and Ciro, because we are working off of 2 different management plans in 2 different regions. So if we do want to go down the rulemaking route, we'll have to do that in conjunction with the South Atlantic, which could be a lengthy process. So if that's the route we take, I would not anticipate that this would happen next year. I would anticipate it probably wouldn't be till 2030. And that's to under promise. We could get it done sooner, but to throw caution to the wind, I would say 2030.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the question, Chris. That's a great question. Not seeing any other hands. Oh, go ahead, Lori.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are we assuming that trip limits and bag limits are the same, or is that another motion to follow?
Under this motion, it would change nothing other than the specifications or the catch and landing limit. So the commercial possession limit and recreational stuff would all remain status quo. If you guys want to make a separate motion that adds no changes to the recreational and commercial measures, you can, but it's not a requirement.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that question as well. Before I call the question of the council, I'll go to the public. I do see one hand, James Fletcher. And Jim, I apologize. I didn't go to the public for questions. So if you would like to speak to the motion, or if you have a question for Hannah, go ahead.
Thank you for your time. My question is, given the pines that you have, has anybody calculated if you go from They say the habitat is 240 feet to 780 feet. If you come up the coast and figure the square miles from South Carolina, North Carolina line to the Massachusetts line, what you're proposing as pounds comes out to be less than point whatever pounds per square mile. Now, someone needs to look at this, that we are not harvesting what is out there in the area. My question is, has anybody figured out these proposed poundages per acre or per square mile of habitat bottom? There is a problem that we're not, I don't know how to explain it. I'll just leave it at that. James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association. But the question is, how many pounds per square mile does this have us harvesting? Thank you.
Thank you for the question / comment. I don't think we have an answer here right now, so we'll we'll have Hannah take that back with her. So now we do have a motion and a second. So the motion is before us. I'll try this the easy way. Is there any objection to the motion? Not seeing any. Good. We'll consider that passed by unanimous consent. Are there any other motions to come before us? Not seeing any. So as per the discussion to Lori's question, we will also make note that all measures will stay status quo with that as well. All right. Anything else, Hannah, needs to come before? Okay, great. With that, we are running a little early. We had a discussion here. The presentations for the afternoon, we are hesitant. We don't want to move any of those. They're on the agenda, and I think some folks from the public will be looking to listen in at those appropriate times. So we will be taking a longer lunch until 1. Before we break, Chris has an announcement about an event this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think everyone here remembers that we have a reception this evening. So the details have been provided to you. One of the details is money. So there's $30 involved with the reception. If you're interested, you can pay Shelley at lunch. So she'll be available to take your payment. I also see that our key speaker is here in the back. Hi, Sam. So welcome, and certainly looking forward to the reception this evening. Thanks.
All right. With that, we will adjourn until 1. Thanks, everyone.